So first I'd like to introduce the gentleman far left, Terry Galway, who's the director of the John Keene Center for American History at Keene University in Union, New Jersey. He is a former member of the New York Times editorial board and a city editor of the New York Observer. He is the author of several books, including Let Every Nation Know, a study of John F. Kennedy's speeches co-written with Robert Dallek, So Others Might Live, a history of the fire department of New York, and The Irish in America, a companion book to the PBS series. He was curator of the exhibit Headline News, The Life and Transformation of the Great American Newspaper at Liberty Hall Museum, Keene University in the fall of 2009. He served as a consultant to the Museum of the City of New York for its 2008 exhibit, Catholics in New York, and he edited a book of essays about Catholics in New York that was published by Fordham University Press. He's currently a PhD student at Rutgers University and is working on a dissertation about ethnic politics in Tammany Hall in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then I'm going to introduce, next to him is Richard Welch, is an adjunct professor of history at Long Island University and Farmingdale State College. He is the author of 4 books, numerous articles, and contributed to the Encyclopedia of New York State. And King of the Bowery, his political biography of Big Tim Sullivan, is his latest book, and that's for sale out in the lobby, and we're gonna, after the Q&A, Richard will join us in the lobby to, we'll be selling, and he'll sign books. And Peter Quinn, right next to me on my left here, was raised and educated in the Bronx. He was a speechwriter for 2 New York governors and recently retired as corporate editorial director at Time Warner. He is author of 3 novels, one of which he only mentioned the 3rd one that is coming out, but I also wanted to mention Banished Children of Eve because it's one of my favorite books about New York, novels about New York. His 3rd novel, The Man Who Never Returned, which is based on the still unsolved disappearance of New York State Supreme Court Justice Joseph Crater, will be published on August 6, 2010. And then I'll introduce Pete, even though he's not here, and hope that it will conjure him. He has been a New York journalist since the summer of 1960. Starting as a street reporter, he has covered wars in Vietnam, Nicaragua, Lebanon, and Northern Ireland, political campaigns, World Series games, and championship fights, with the occasional homicide thrown in. In addition to his many years as a columnist, he has served as editor-in-chief of both the New York Post and the New York Daily News. He's the author of 22 books, including Why Sinatra Matters and the best-selling memoir, A Drinking Life. His 10 novels include Snow in August, another one of my favorites, Forever, and North River. There he is. Well, I was right that introducing him would conjure him. Here he is. Born in Brooklyn, Pete is the oldest of 7 children of Irish immigrant parents. After service in the U.S. Navy, he attended Mexico City College in 1956-57 as a student on the GI Bill, and later studied at Pratt Institute. He has 2 daughters and 1 grandson, and they live in Tribeca. He lives in Tribeca, and he is currently a distinguished writer in residence at NYU. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Peter Quinn, who is going to start us off. Thanks very much.
For one horrible minute there, I thought you would all think this was a Tammany scam, and then we said Pete Hamill would be here, and he wouldn't be. But it's not a Tammany scam, at least this once. And since this evening is devoted to Tammany Hall, I propose to Suzanne Wasserman that we hand out ballots at the end so that you, the audience, could vote on which of tonight's 4 presentations you enjoy the most. Given my family's history of involvement in Bronx politics, as well as my experience as a speechwriter for 2 Democratic governors, I also volunteered to undertake the tedious work of counting up the ballots. And so, before proceeding with the boring formality of the vote, let me speed things up by announcing the results. Out of 207 ballots cast, Richard Welch got 1. Pete Hamill, who finally showed up, got 2. And for those of you who know him, this will come as no surprise. Terry Galway none. As in zilch, nada, bupkis. The remaining 204 votes went to Peter Quinn. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of myself, I humbly thank you for this show of support. The results of this election confirm my faith in the democratic process, as well as reaffirm that ancient adage of Daniel O'Connell, who led the Albany Democratic machine for 5 decades. Honesty is no substitute for experience. Now, I don't mean to treat Tammany as a joke, although more often than not, that's how it's remembered, as a quasi-punchline to some observation about modern-day political corruption that on cable television usually ends as, well, that would have done Tammany proud. As if the current hog-trough mutual feasting of special interests, insider trading, outsourcing, private contracting, lobbyist special pleading, and the incestuous interlocking directorate of corporate, financial, and governmental officialdom, and let's not forget the troubled asset relief program, didn't exceed the patronage-rich wet dreams of George Washington Plunkett and his cohorts. Corruption there was, of course, plenty of it, and most, but by no means all, associated with monikers like Honest John Kelly and Tin Box Farley. But if that's all there were, if Tammany was never more than an ethno-political scam run by Patty Crooks, how is it that it stayed in power for so long, controlling the destiny of the country's most important and complex city for much of the latter half of the 19th and the first decades of the 20th centuries, and did so despite the fact that the Irish had long ceased to be a demographic majority in metropolitan New York? Did Tammany's long run as one of the most successful urban political organizations of all time lay in nothing more than its ability to fool, if not all of the people, all of the time, than to fool a sufficient amount of the time to keep the game of big league grafting going on? I'm not a professional historian. As Suzanne mentioned, I'm a historical novelist, a trafficker in half-truths, untruths, and outright lies. But I've read enough history to be amazed at the lack of consideration or reconsideration given to these questions by academic as well as popular historians. There are some notable exceptions. Nancy Weiss's monograph on Charles Francis Murphy, Joseph Hethmacher's Robert F. Wagner and the Rise of Urban Liberalism, Robert Ackerman's recent biography of William Tweed, and Richard Welch's wonderfully enlightening book on Big Tim Sullivan, among them. But these are the exceptions. In the main, the enduring edge of Tammany and its urban cousins is of self-dealing Irish Poles whose chronic short-sightedness and incurable cupidity finally led, thank God, and good riddance to their demise. 2 recent books that overall are well worth reading illustrate what I'm talking about. First is Triangle, The Fire That Changed America, David Von Driel's very fine account of the tragic 1911 conflagration in a shirtwaist factory on Washington Place that led to the death of 150 immigrant women. As well as vividly recreate the fire and its consequences, Von Driel examines the backgrounds of the women who died and the men who employed them, bringing the story back to the Eastern European shtetls and pogroms that Jewish immigrants had fled, and the desperate poverty that compelled the southern Italian peasantry to become a worldwide diaspora. But when it comes to Charles Francis Murphy and Tammany, there's little, if any, sense of where they came from, what formed them, or what besides sheer political expediency drove them to devise and enact the most progressive set of social reforms since the Republic had been formed. It's as if Tammany had arrived with Henry Hudson on the half moon, and Murphy emerged full-grown from the head of, if not Zeus, then Boss Tweed. The second book is Jill Jonas' Conquering Gotham, Building Penn Station and Its Tunnels, a very well-told rendering of the Herculean efforts that went into creating New York's grandest, now vanished, and forever to be lamented Penn Station, and the vast engineering project that it was part of. It's a great New York story, made all the more dramatic by the battle between good and evil, as pug-nosed, big-bellied micks do their best to loot public and private purses while noble railroad men seek to serve the causes of civic improvement and economic progress. There's little mention of the wanton corruption, union busting, and crony capitalism that were part and parcel of American industry in general, and railroads in particular, or the collusion with monopolies like Standard Oil, an outfit so skilled at having its political way that it was said it had done just about everything there was to do with the Republican-dominated legislature of Pennsylvania except refine it. What set Tammany apart in particular, and other Irish-run urban political machines in general, wasn't the grafting that to one degree or another characterized most political organizations, Democratic and Republican alike. Rather, it was a concentrated focus on three priorities: power, parochialism, and practicality, that were all rooted in the Great Famine, an event that shaped Irish and Irish-American history for the next 150 years. The founding fathers and most successful operators of the Irish political machines, whether Richard Croaker, Tim Sullivan, and Charlie Murphy in New York, or Tom Prendergast in Kansas City, or Frank Hague in Jersey City, on, take your pick, all either arrived during the famine or were the children of famine immigrants. And here I might note that it was in America and not Ireland where the first Irish political leaders who weren't members of the Anglo-Irish gentry, educated professional classes, or the few Catholic landowning families rose to power. Now, it's not my purpose to revisit the controversies that surround the famine or get bogged down in the particulars of what happened or where to attach the blame for what happened. Still, it's really impossible to understand Tammany, or for that matter, much of the subsequent Irish Catholic history in America, without some idea of the enormity of what occurred and its enduring impact and the special impression that it made that came out in places like Tammany Hall. When the Potato Blight struck in the late summer of 1845, Ireland was a country of over 8.5 million people. It's 6 million today. About 100,000, or a little over 1%, were enfranchised to vote, and many of these voted as directed by their landlords. Politically, the massive campaign directed by Daniel Connell, who led the campaign for Catholic emancipation, and the campaign he led now was for the repeal of the union with Great Britain and the return of domestic self-rule to Dublin, had recently been suppressed by the British government. Ireland's fate in 1845 rested in the hands of the Parliament in London and the administration it controlled in Dublin. According to parliamentary reports, about 40% of the country inhabited unsuitable and unsanitary dwellings, and about 3 million people, mostly subtenants and laborers, went hungry each year between the time the old potato crop was harvested and the new one brought in. In the opening phase of official reaction to the massive failure of the potato crop, faced with a peacetime catastrophe no longer imaginable in mid-19th century Western Europe, the British government took extraordinary measures. American corn was imported, and the public works to begin to ensure the means to buy that corn were earned and not given as charity, thus encouraging what was seen as the natural proclivity of the Irish peasantry to laziness and beggary. The next year, when it became obvious that these measures wouldn't stave off widespread starvation, a nationwide system of government soup kitchens was set up. At its height, the system fed 3 million people a day. There were rules laid down to instill a measure of discipline in the supposedly congenitally undisciplined peasantry. Individuals had to provide their own bowls and spoons. Families couldn't be served unless every member was present, and no food could be taken from the premises. But the system worked. In September 1847, however, the soup kitchens were closed. The administration declared that the famine was over, even though it wasn't. Except in its policing capacity, power absented itself. Nature would take its course. The markets would decide. The Treasury wouldn't provide any more aid. Whatever was required would be the responsibility of Irish landlords, most of them now bankrupt. Instead of relief, Parliament passed a new Vagrancy Act to punish begging, as well as a new Coercion Act to bring more troops into Ireland, as well as measures designed to facilitate large-scale land clearances. Over the next several years, it's estimated some 500,000 people were forced off the land or formally evicted. By 1848, 900,000 people were crowded into a draconian system of poorhouses intended for, at best, 150,000 people. Families that had once done everything possible to stay out of the poorhouses rioted to get in. By the time the famine was over, 1 million people, 1/8 of the country, had died. The famine not only took the worst toll of civilian deaths in Western Europe between the 30 Years' War and World War I, but it was among the most destructive famines in modern history. No peacetime European social crisis since the 17th century, writes historian Peter Gray, with the possible exception of the Ukrainian famine of the early 1930s, has equaled it in intensity and scale. In the decade between 1845 and 1855, 2.1 million people, or 1/4 of the country, left. 1.5 million came to North America. The number of Irish entering the U.S. equaled the total of immigrants who'd arrived in the 70 years since independence was declared. 1 million came through the port of New York. These weren't the immigrants conjured up in Jeffersonian fantasies of the American future. Stalwart Anglo-Saxon yeomen, independent farmers, budding Unitarians, and freethinkers equipped with a basic literacy and economic independence. These were subtenants and laborers, disoriented and disorganized, steeped in a history of sullen, often violent resistance to all the officials, institutions that rule their country, the government, the ruling class, the established church. Compared with immigrants from Scandinavia or Germany, mostly farmers, artisans, and tradespeople, less than 10% of famine immigrants were farmers, and 12% claimed to be artisans. As historian Kirby Miller has pointed out, these immigrants were overwhelmingly Catholic, illiterate, and though this is often forgotten, Irish-speaking. They were unlike anything America had seen before, and unsurprisingly, they became very quickly unwelcome. In an 1855 address to the Massachusetts legislature, the newly elected Know-Nothing Governor Henry Gardiner compared them to, quote, the horde of barbarians whose arrival spelled the downfall of the Roman Empire. Soon enough, as well as Massachusetts, Know-Nothing, anti-Catholic, anti-Irish parties control the legislatures of almost all the New England states, as well as those of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and of course New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and California. Now, one of the most annoying notions, at least to me, currently in fashion in some academic circles, is how the Irish eventually threw off this pariah status by becoming white. But as I see it, and Tammany is a big part of it, the real story isn't how the Irish became white, but how they stayed Irish, how they reorganized and rebuilt badly broken and shattered traditional rural communities in the context of the dynamic, fast-changing circumstances of urban America, and mastered the realities of American power arrangements in order to enter American society on their own terms. Very briefly, I'd like to look at that process of reorganization and rebuilding in terms of Tammany Hall and the three priorities I mentioned earlier: power, parochialism, and practicality. Though Victorian racial theorists from Charles Darwin to Charles Loring Brace agreed that the Irish were an inferior human subspecies, their defining characteristic wasn't color, but a lack of material resources, which was most often attributed, both as cause and effect, to the prevalence among them of popery or Roman Catholicism. But Catholics, though they were, the famine immigrants weren't the vigorously obedient and rigorously observant Irish Americans who became practically synonymous with the American church by the end of the 19th century. That came with time, and in the beginning owed itself largely to the efforts of one man, a pre-famine immigrant and former spalpeen or laborer, New York's first archbishop and the first real political leader in America, Archbishop John Hughes. The growing Irish Catholic community he inherited wasn't only impoverished, but in a formal sense, it wasn't very Catholic. Catholic dogma was heavily larded with Celtic folk beliefs. Mass going was lax. There were few priests, fewer nuns, and fewer prospects for vocations. Hughes perceived that the fundamental American equation is a power game. You get what you want in this country not because you ask or plead or because you deserve it, but because you demand it. And more important, you back up that demand with a community cohesive, disciplined, and organized enough to turn numbers into political clout. A generation before the Irish took over Tammany, Hughes, more chieftain than universal-minded churchman, made the Catholic Church a primary instrument of adjustment and reorganization, building a parish-based structure from the ground up, capable of protecting, organizing, disciplining, educating, and transforming what had been an immigrant horde or a mob into a nascent community whose interests couldn't be ignored, into a political army. Hughes died in 1864, physically broken and psychically bruised by the embarrassment of the draft riots, which is when Tweed and Tammany Hall stepped in. Tammany, it's worth remembering, was an American and not Irish invention. It owes its beginnings to Aaron Burr. And Tweed flirted with nativism before recognizing the power of the Irish vote and writing their support to political dominance. And Tweed was a crook. He died in jail. The only crook, it's worth remembering, among the bipartisan legion of self-enriching crooks of that era to do so. But he was also a master politician who understood that along with some measure of physical relief, what the poor wanted most of all wasn't sermons on self-reliance or verdicts about their moral worthiness as recipients of private charity. They wanted, as the Queen of Soul has put it, RSEPECT, respect, which, along with bread and work, is what Tweed gave them. And when he died, the morally upright rejoiced. But the Irish poor, many of whom recall the famine not as distant folk memory, but as searing personal experience of starvation, desperation, eviction, and disrespect and discrimination at every turn, they remembered him as someone who, instead of spitting or sneering, courted their vote, and they mourned him. In Daniel Patrick Moynihan's famous formulation, the problem with the Irish was once that they'd taken over Tammany Hall and achieved political power, they didn't know what to do with it. Now, as much as I respect the late senator, I respectfully disagree. The famine imprinted the lesson that the first priority of power is getting and keeping it out of the hands of those who would use it against you. Keeping power precedes using power. Before power is a sword, it's a shield. Tammany's power rested, as its founders and operators never lost sight of, on its parochialism. Not in the religious sense of that word, though many New York Catholics identify themselves to this day by parish rather than neighborhood, but in the sense of belonging or relating to the most basic unit of local government. If you want an idea of what that devotion to parochialism meant in practice, what is today called tending to the grassroots, read Tom Fleming's brilliant and illuminating inside take on the Jersey City machine in his memoir, Mysteries of My Father, or Jim Fisher's recent masterpiece, On the Irish Waterfront, or take a look at Theodore Dreiser's essay, The Michael J. Powers Association, in his 1916 book, The Color of a Great City. No admirer of Tammany's, Dreiser nonetheless marvels how when a constituent in search of help enters the clubhouse, the first thing the district leader does is to address him as an equal and accord him respect. Put on your hat, man, the leader tells him when the man coming in takes it off. No one is expected to put off his hat in here. And when the composition of the neighborhood changed, the machine survived by changing with it. George Washington Plunkett records how Johnny Ahern, a leader on the Lower East Side, eats corned beef and kosher meat with equal nonchalance. And it's all the same to Johnny, whether he takes off his hat in a church or pulls it down over his ears in a synagogue. Plunkett tells as well of the care he put into wooing a group of Wall Street janitors, where a turn-of-the-century eugenicist would have seen ignorant, mop-wielding southern Mediterraneans who embodied a growing threat to the country's Anglo-Saxon gene pool. Plunkett saw a collection of proud voters whose concerns had to be attended to. Parochialism reinforced Tammany's practicality. Maybe nobody has ever better caught that relationship than William Kennedy in his novel Roscoe. For my money, the best novel ever written about urban machines, and head and shoulders above Edward O'Connor's highly sentimental Last Hurrah. At one point in the book, Kennedy takes us inside the minds of the machine politicians who were up in Albany pleading with Governor Franklin Roosevelt, then entering his 1932 campaign for president, to overlook the corruption brought to light by the Seabury Commission and support a regular as opposed to a reformer to run for a seat as governor. The true question, they tell FDR in true Tammany ingratiating fashion, isn't abstractions like integrity and honesty, but jobs, Frank, jobs and families, the flower of our meaning, the source of our blessedness. We have been chosen to raise up the people. These people can't make it on their own, Frank, but they're our future. Little boys on the altar, darling girls playing hopscotch. God bless them all. The world is not Irish, Frank, and it's certainly not Dutch. We're all trying to do right, but we need people who matter, who will do what is good for them and for us. That's all we're asking, Frank. Mixed in with the obvious bullshit about altar boys and darling girls, and the equally obvious self-interest office holders who'll do good for them and for us, is a phrase as truthful as it has been unfashionable. These people who can't make it on their own. For the last 30 years, our national political faith has largely reflected the notion that every person, no matter how poor, deprived, disabled, confused, mentally ill, has it in his or her individual power to go from rags to riches. Government, we're told, is the cause of poverty and powerlessness, not the solution. Tammany was built on the opposing notion that the laissez-faire ethic of free market capitalism will always create losers as well as winners. And during the famine, the losers among the Irish in that laissez-faire lottery, they numbered in the millions. And even if by some miracle the playing field were made perfectly level, there will still be, in the words of those leaders, these people who can't make it on their own. Large numbers, some temporarily, others permanently, mentally or physically hobbled, unable to compete. Now, the local machines couldn't theorize these people out of existence or chalk up their fate to the gods of macroeconomics. The unemployed sat on the neighborhood stoops, and they stood on the street corners. Their wives and mothers came into the clubhouse pleading, and they voted. Attention had to be paid. The evil walked hand in hand with the good. Okay. The machines didn't subject the poor to a bureaucratic inquisition to determine eligibility for assistance. They were helped. Immigrants were mocked for their ignorance. Weren't mocked for their ignorance. They were courted for their vote. Loyalty counted for more than competency. Connections more than merit. Practicality had a place above legality. Appointments to public sector jobs saved families from economic ruin. Working class parents obtained jobs that gave them the wherewithal to send their children to college and to push them into private sector jobs. And hacks abounded. Despite raising up credible leaders like Al Smith and Robert Wagner, the machines weren't meritocracies. What they were was the anti-eugenic party, the enemy of social Darwinism, and the idea that some are more worthy of survival than others. Corrupt, inefficient, patronage-laden, the machines were an example of how outsiders can wield democratic politics to push their interests against insiders. And they were creatures of their times, a tactic of the marginalized in an era when government took no active role in protecting them from predatory capitalism and collective penury. For most of their history, they were conservative in nature, moderating the worst effects of the economic system instead of agitating for its overthrow. But they weren't static. They evolved. A social safety net in this country was eventually woven for the entire people out of materials manufactured in part by the democratic urban machines. But they shouldn't be romanticized as embodiments of politics in the so-called good old days, for the simple reason that for most people, there were no good old days. Only poverty, disease, infant mortality, social dislocation, and the difficult, often brutal struggle of immigrant masses to adjust and move ahead, not to mention the glaring, still festering original sin of racism and racial inequality and racial injustice. Tammany is gone. The bosses molder in their graves. But it seems to me not all of the lessons of the old-style politics should be ignored or dismissed or ridiculed. Here, at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the question who gets to run the government and to whose benefit is as fresh as ever. And if the cries for reform become nothing more than an attempt to repair the system to the benefit of the elites who broke it in the first place, if the bankers' troubled assets get relief while troubled homeowners from the middle and lower classes shown the door, if the flesh and blood people who can't make it on their own are once again sacrificed to free market orthodoxies and casino capitalism, then maybe the hour has come around at last to revive the old Tammany slogan, "To hell with reform." Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And Terry, you should be consoled. If you get 0 votes, you will only be an unindicted co-conspirator. They can't indict you for cheating an election if you get 0. So.
Vote for myself.
One thing is probably still true from the old days. It's better to know the judge than to know the law. You know. At Tammany, in its Brooklyn version, in other words, the organized Brooklyn organization, Tammany was really a Manhattan organization, predating the unifying of the boroughs into one city. But it was still there when I was a kid. And the guys would come around, the ward healer, and would come around on Saturdays, buy drinks for people in the many bars that existed all over my neighborhood. And I never thought about them as corrupt or any of that until much later, when I got interested in cartooning and I saw the cartoons of Thomas Nast and read the history of Thomas Nast and what Thomas Nast did with Boss Tweed and how Nast ended up. But I think this country has been hurt by the vanishing of those democratic machines. And the most important way that we've been hurt is the current immigration mess. This would never have happened if those old machines were here, because that was one of the things those machines did. They were processing plants for immigrants. You wanted to become a citizen? Go down to that table over there, ask for Louise. She'll fill the papers out for you. You sign your names, we'll send them in, and show up on Monday in Bush Terminal and ask for Louie. All you had to do was vote for them for the rest of your life. And actually, it was a pretty good deal because it humanized the process. How much better to know the district leader than to go and become number 79365 at the welfare department. How much better was that? You knew who it was. You knew who it was, a human at the other end. And the human knew that you, a human, were there. And I have a very personal understanding of that. My father, Billy Hamill, from Belfast, Northern Ireland, came to the United States in 1923, and in 1927 he lost his leg playing soccer in the immigrant leagues. He was kicked terribly in a game, not on purpose, just it's a tough game. Taken to Kings County Hospital in days before there was penicillin. By the morning, gangrene had set in, and he had an appointment with the guy with the saw. It changed his life, obviously. He couldn't get to use the contacts he had through his brothers who all worked in the commerce of the port. They were either longshoremen, or they loaded trucks, or they worked building ships in the different building ways, Todd shipyards, among others. He couldn't do that. And when he finally recovered from the loss of his leg and the end of his youth, one of the local Democratic guys said, "Let me see your handwriting." And he wrote a couple of things out with his right hand. And the guy says, "That's pretty good. How'd you learn to write that way?" And some nun in Ireland had beaten him into writing well, since he was left-handed when he started out. And he got a job in a grocery chain as a clerk and worked there right through the Depression for $19 a week. But I think from that generation, most of them did not like the idea of what was then called relief. They wanted work. They didn't want to sit on a stoop and wait for a check. They wanted work. And on that $19 a week, he was able to marry my mother, to begin a family starting with me and followed by 6 others, and to become an absolute American after about the time he got baseball. Not from reading the Federalist Papers, not from reading de Tocqueville, from reading Dick Young in the Daily News and the Brooklyn Eagle, and occasionally the Journal American. So that was an example of one life changed by a local leader. And I think thousands and thousands were changed. So as someone who believes in the forgiveness of sin, I always forgive, particularly mine. I understand that there was corruption. A lot of it is very complicated. The new biographies of Tweed that have been done a lot of research showed that he didn't end up enriching himself very much. He would take the money, go up to Albany, and bribe the Republicans. One perfect example of it was the case of the Croton water. When water finally began to flow into Manhattan from the Croton Reservoir for the first time, fresh water coming from high above us, they skipped the 5 points. They didn't think the Irish needed water. And that's where the myth of the dirty Irish came from. It was true. They had no water. Or they would have to walk as far as downtown to carry it back like coolies on a pole across their shoulders and bring it home. And Tweed, before he was the boss, he went bonkers on this and went up to Albany and demanded that the water come downtown to the poor too. And so when the draft riots did break out, the 5 points was basically quiet. Most of the fighting was up in 23rd Street, 25th Street, up that way, or down below the 5 points where they sacked Brooks Brothers. What the hell? You know, not as an example of fashion criticism, but they couldn't eat wool anyway. They were looking for something else. But what Peter was talking about, that whole the Ireland that they brought with them brought it in their baggage, was part of the tale too. Most of them, like the Puerto Ricans and blacks after World War II, were from agricultural backgrounds. They didn't know from cities. People went across the ocean, left Ireland without seeing Dublin, got in boats, got here, and saw more people in an hour than they had seen in their entire lives in the little villages they left. The ones that came from cities had what an occupied people always develop, a gift for conspiracy. You tell somebody one thing, knowing that its opposite is probably what you're really talking about. And they brought that here, which allowed the Irish to become some of the first organized criminals, but also gave them the gift, I think, of politically organizing to create the change that was necessary. To get back to Nast, for example, his later career, Nast was the greatest cartoonist of the 19th century. He worked for Harper's Weekly. He was a great, great cartoonist. But he was against slavery. He was a supporter of Chinese laborers who were brought to the States, but he hated the Irish, and particularly their Catholicism. There's a famous cartoon where guys with bishops' mitres are coming ashore in America looking like alligators coming out of the sea. It's one of the greatest cartoonists ever, but it's about me, or my ancestors, who are not famine Irish. All of that, his greatest fame of bringing down Tweed and forcing indictments of Tweed in the ring, was followed very shortly by the change among the Irish who became literate. They started to read newspapers. They started to read magazines. And within a couple of years, Thomas Nast was unemployable. The publishers knew they either have Nast or they get Irish readers. They chose the Irish readers. The New York Times, maybe not exactly, but under Mr. Henry Raymond, who was the editor at the time. But basically, it changed that way. In the end, poor Nast, at the end of the century, he tried to be a painter. The paintings are not very good. He did invent Santa Claus, which was one of the great merchandising discoveries that allowed everybody, Jews, Christians, Buddhists, agnostics, to believe they could go and buy stuff at Macy's, and it would be a sign of good fellowship. So he did do that, but he couldn't get to practice the craft that had made him famous. At the very end, in 1902, he pleaded with the Grant administration, or somebody down in Washington. He pleaded for a job. They sent him to Ecuador, where there were about 3 Irishmen in the whole country at the time. He was there only a couple of weeks. He sent back these wonderful postcards to his family, full of beautiful drawings and some jokes. And he contracted either, it's not clear, either yellow fever or cholera, and died in another week and was brought back dead. He's buried up in Woodlawn. My personal end of it, of this tale, was a few years ago. I had to, my wife's father died, and she said, we have to get a plot. And I said, a plot to do what? I was thinking, like a newspaper man. No, in the ground. I said, okay. And I called Greenwood Cemetery and said, I'm looking for a plot. what do you have out there? He says, well, do you have anything left? Because they have about 500,000 graves out there. And he says, yeah, we got a few things left. I said, do you have anything near Boss Tweed? He said, wait a minute. He was back in about 13 seconds. I'm sure it was 2, 3, 4. And then he got back. As a matter of fact, yes. So off we go to Greenwood Cemetery the following day, my wife and I, and there's Boss Tweed's grave. And there's about another dozen people behind a little low chain, including things like names like Albie. I don't know if it's the dog, some gunman. There's no second name. I don't know who it was. But in the same cemetery, Albert Anastasia has a plot too, so worse than Tweed is there. And so we bought it. It has a wonderful view. You can see the towers of Manhattan from up on the hill. You can see the Verrazano Bridge in the beginning of the journey to Europe. Whoever picked it for the boss had amazing good taste. And I thought, we'll have some fun out here. I began to think of writing a little play called The New Neighborhood, with all the scoundrels that are buried in places like that, you know, particularly the ones with 2 last names, you know, with a hyphen. There's a whole bunch of them out there, too. What Meade Esposito, the Brooklyn boss, once called people who part their names in the middle. But I also, when I went out there and reading a lot about Tweed and Tammany, because he's a figure in one of my novels, very brief part of the novel, but I was always reminded of my father, who was an immigrant, and he had basically 3 laws in life. One was always pay your debts. The second was never cross a picket line. And the third was vote the straight ticket. So he was a loyalist. He believed if you give your word, you keep it. And he lived long enough to see Ronald Reagan elected by people who had all changed their mind for a while, union guys and old children of immigrants and so on. But he voted straight ticket. I would love to see, based on some of the things that Peter was talking about, I would love to see the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, which is unlikely. I can't imagine that the current Republican Party has room even for Fiorello LaGuardia or Jacob Javits or Louis Lefkowitz or any of the wonderful liberal politicians who couldn't bring themselves to go to the Democratic Party because of Tammany in the 30s. But I would love to see a return to the service-oriented politics that those machines offered, which is not simply to get a judgeship or to get a political job, but to sometimes you needed a bail bondsman. You went down to see them. Sometimes the breadwinner in a family died suddenly. The local guys would run the beer rackets that raised the money to get the man buried and get the widow through the next 2 or 3 months until they could get on their feet. I would love to see that. A good example is there's an estimated 12 million Mexicans in the country, illegals. They have 3 million American kids. And we can't have a country in which we take women and drag them out of chicken processing plants and send them off and leave their American children to the tender mercies of daycare or foster care or any of the other programs that hope to create what a family is. We can't allow that. And I would think those machines, if they were organized better and could deliver votes, would have a powerful effect on the discussion of how to solve this immigration mess that we're in right now. I think the other thing that was wrong with its end, because that I did witness as a reporter and otherwise, was the vehement abstraction of the reformers. And the reformers were right. Some of it had to be cleaned up. But casting politicians as the devil is always a mistake, because you can't negotiate with the devil. It becomes about theology in some way and not about practical stuff. And one of the pieces that I love, and I'll just read a paragraph of it if I may, it was from the New York Post in 1961. I didn't write it. It was written by Murray Kempton, and it was about the primary night when Carmine DeSapio lost to a fellow named Lanigan. And it was, even though Tammany lasted a little bit longer, it was the true end. But Kempton, who in the 30s had been a member of the Young Socialist League, was a man of the left, thought that many of the things that had gone wrong had been brought by Joe McCarthy and J. Parnell Thomas, all these other dumbbells that ran these different Who's More American Than Me programs, the vehement right. Kempton always was friends with somebody in Tammany. He stayed friends with Ray Jones after Carmine DeSapio left, because he went out to see them. He didn't stand up, read an article in a paper and cast judgment. He went to Harlem to see Ray Jones and sat around and saw what they did for people. He was out in Brooklyn visiting these guys and saw what they did, which was getting harder and harder by the time of this. So this is from his piece of September 8th, 1961. The votes are in. He knows he's left, and Kempton stays around with DeSapio. It was then 1 o'clock. Sidney Barron said that Carmine was tired and hadn't eaten, and someone should get him a sandwich. Carmine DeSapio roused himself as though he had lost his manners and said he was sorry. They must be hungry. Could he get them a sandwich? That way his visitor left him, Kempton, and walked into the streets and noticed that there were no slums anymore and no landlords, and the age of Pericles had begun because we were rid of Carmine DeSapio. One had to walk carefully to avoid being stabbed by the lilies bursting in the pavements. I wish the reformers luck, says Kempton, with less Christian sincerity than Carmine DeSapio does. I will be a long time forgiving them this one. So it was not that the reformers were all the good guys and the Tammany guys were all the bad guys, even among people who differed politically in ways like Kempton. There was a sense, if you get rid of them, what are you going to put there? And the reformers had nothing to put there except abstractions and moral judgments, but nothing practical, nothing that got a kid into school or another kid out of jail, nothing that really made the city more human. And I think we've been hurt by it. And discussions of particularly the background that Peter just sketched in helps us understand better why it evolved into what it was and why we so sorely miss it right now. Thank you.
Good evening. Peter mentioned that as an historical novelist, sometimes he deals with facts, sometimes he deals with fiction, and sometimes he deals with, I think he said, historical half-truths. I once had a professor who said that only librarians put books into fiction and nonfiction with absolute certainty. So I don't know if he's actually doing really that bad. In fact, I know he's doing very, very well. What I'd like to talk about just a little bit is Tammany, when it's up and running, post-Tweed, also post-Croaker, and maybe at its peak in terms of Irish control, and also when it's at sort of a point in transition. Historians are always fond of pointing out eras of transition. In fact, there's a joke that historians think every era is an era of transition. But New York, when you're talking about between approximately 1885 and the onset of the Great War in 1914, definitely is an era of transition. For one thing, the forces of urbanization are becoming increasingly more intense, and they're also becoming more complex. They're becoming more complex because the economics are changing, industrialization is spreading, communication, transportation, globalism, even though that's a modern buzzword, all of these things are absolutely there. You're also finding the city is dealing with new waves of immigration. The German and Irish immigration certainly is going to continue down to the First World War, but it's going to become increasingly overshadowed by immigration from Eastern Europe, both Slavic and Jewish, also Southern Europe, particularly Italian, and occasionally even people from the Middle East. So the city's in transition, although the government has not caught up with it. And one of the reasons why an institution like Tammany does as well as it does and performs such an important role is that it undertakes to deal with the massive wave of immigrants and also their first and sometimes second generation children, often scorned at by the powers that be, the elite groups, and sometimes both feared and loathed by let's say, more established ethnic groups. And Tammany is going to take them in and is going to try to organize them, and it's going to provide services which otherwise these people would not have. In fact, Richard Croaker, usually referred to as Boss Croaker, once posed a question to a reporter: if we don't provide these people with work, or we provide them with at least basic housing, or provide them with some kind of food, fuel, education, etc., who is going to do it? And the truth is, at the time, there really was nothing established that could do that particularly well. In terms of Tammany, it is also a time of transition. It does literally have one foot in the past in a very rough and tumble kind of politics, which is democratic in the sense that there is popular participation, but it is also in many ways coerced. It is about as dirty as it comes. There are raids at ballot boxes. There are literally fights in the voting booths. There are thefts of ballots. Thank God that doesn't happen anymore. But this was considerably more overt, and in fact, it's only when you get to the 1880s, 1890s that the secret ballot itself is going to become, more or less standard. And so the possibility of, either intimidation or the possibility of stealing votes was much more, let's say, in your face as far as that is concerned. So Tammany and many of its practitioners are going to be certainly familiar with these type of techniques, and they will use them certainly down through the time of the First World War. But they also had perfected their kind of practical politics, which we've heard so much about. They perfected the ability to provide work for their followers. They perfected means in which they could provide such things as social settings. They could provide entertainment. They could provide outings. They could provide, again, food, fuel, this particular type of thing. On the other hand, Tammany, like New York, is groping towards something more modern. The politics are indeed changing. The very fact that the population continues to grow and the demographics become more complex and more nuanced is beginning beginning to lead to the understanding, even if it is more or less unconscious, that things may have to be done in a more structural or institutional fashion. This is going to be something which will be achieved by fits and starts, and sometimes it is going to be provoked by the reformers and Tammany's political opponents for whom they have near contempt, because, as Pete mentioned, the reformers were sometimes correct. Some of it was just too much graft, some of it was just too much corruption, some of it was just too much trickery, that particular type of thing. The person who I've spent most of my recent research years dealing with is a fellow by the name of Timothy Daniel Sullivan, who became known at an early age to his friends and enemies alike as Big Tim Sullivan. He was indeed a child of the great Irish famine of the mid-century. Not that he was born in Ireland, but his parents were effectively driven out of Ireland by the effects of the famine. He was born in the area toward the West Side docks, but he grew up primarily in the Five Points section in downtown, which I guess was sort of the epicenter of Irish-American poverty or immigrant Irish poverty at that particular time. He came from a broken home. His father died. He himself was born in 1862, a year before the draft riots. His father, I believe, dies in 1867. She marries again. She marries a guy who isn't particularly good. He's a nasty drunk. He exits from the family very quickly, and as far as Tim Sullivan is concerned, he exits from his life. He never mentions him, although he is friends with his half-brothers who were fathered by his stepfather. Sullivan will get some rudimentary education in the sense that, he goes to elementary school through, I believe, the 8th grade, and he certainly was, a reasonably literate person. Later in life, he shows a certain amount of familiarity with some personages you wouldn't expect, such as Demosthenes, or he could, refer to, Daniel Webster in terms of, speaking abilities and that type of thing. And he always was a reader, kept abreast of, the various fashions in reading. But he has to leave, certainly by the time he's in the 8th grade. And one of the things he said he had learned when he was in school is the importance of the Tammany district leaders and their electoral district captains in the downtown area. And the reason was, as he always told the story, he was going to school, it was wintertime, and his shoes were totally broken down. His teacher, who was Irish, took a look at him, says, "I want to see you after class." He thought he was going to get hell for something, but she said, "No, go down and talk to such and such," who was an Irish-American Tammany Hall leader. He goes down there, and what happens is he gets a chit for a pair of shoes. Sullivan never forgot that. And when he became an important person, a genuine power broker in New York politics, one of the things he did as his version of constituent service, and I suppose maybe you could even say payback, is that he distributed shoes to people who were needy or showed up for them around Christmas time every year, beginning, approximately 1896. Sullivan is going to learn about New York as a newsie. He works in newspapers. He's a newspaper boy. He becomes a leader. He's very tall. He's very good-looking. He gets stouter as time goes on, but he was always a good-looking man. And he also had what people who liked him and people didn't like him would today call charisma. I doubt they knew that word, but they certainly described his smile, and they described the fact that people tended to gravitate to them. Makes himself a leader of the Newsies, and then he launches himself into one of the major Irish-American entrepreneurial activities of the time. He begins to buy saloons. The saloon in the Irish-American community had multiple functions. Obviously, it was a place where you could drink. It was also a place where you could socialize. It was also a place where you could stay with people whom you knew. It was also a place which sometimes functioned as an early form of county organization. It was also a political headquarters in many instances, and almost all of the Tammany leaders owned saloons. Interestingly, certainly many of the major leaders drank not at all or very little. Sullivan never drank. All right, and his major captain, who was called Little Tim, who was actually a cousin, did not drink either. This did not mean they would not provide alcohol for all their friends and followers, which they did in copious amounts, all right, but they themselves did not touch it. Charlie Murphy, who was the titular head of the hall from about 1901 on, he was noted for having like one small beer. That's it. He proves his conviviality, and that's the end of it. George Washington Plunkett, who has already been mentioned, he said he never really drank at all. And so a lot of the leaders did not. This does not, of course, mean that none of the leaders did, but Sullivan does not do that. But what he does do as he begins to buy his saloons, and pretty soon he's got 5 of them, is that he begins to attract the notice of Democratic leaders who encourage him to run for office, and he runs for the Assembly in the early 1880s. And very quickly, he becomes an exponent, a voice for the Lower East Side, his area. And this is a time when the Lower East Side is changing dramatically. Partly this is the result of the new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and also I guess it's part of the American story, since we've been talking about it, that the second and third generation Irish and Germans are beginning to move up Manhattan, and in some cases into what later will be called the outer boroughs. So this whole area there is changing, and it's sort of opening up for people like Sullivan. And he is going to become, an exponent of them. And he always, when he speaks publicly in Albany, or when he's, running for his various election campaigns, or he's trying to support some fellows in the hall or other Democrats, whatever the case may be, he always puts on the Lower East Side argot, which was certainly more Irish than it would be today, or maybe any time since the 1960s. And certainly there are indications that he could turn it on and off to a certain degree. I mean, he always certainly was going to talk like a New York Mick, but sometimes he could juice that up, for his audience, as the case may be. After he proves his worth in the presidential elections of 1886, Richard Croaker, who was the boss of Tammany Hall, figured that he might be just the person he needs to go to the 3rd congressional district. And this was not at the time a Tammany stronghold. It was an area which was increasingly polyglot. There still were, strong remnants of the earlier German and Irish presence, but there are increasingly large numbers of Eastern Jews from Poland and the Russian Empire, and also Italians in the area. And so what happens is Tim moves over into basically the Bowery, and he is going to take with him the organization which a later historian will call the machine within a machine. So called because in the Bowery area, in his bastion in the Lower East Side, Sullivan was virtually invincible, so much so that he could function as an independent player, so much so that he did not really show much hesitation in thumbing his nose at either Dick Croaker, or later on tweaking Charlie Murphy's nose when he thought that it was necessary to do so, or useful to do so, as the case may be. The group which he brings with him is going to be primarily family. All right, and there are going to be a lot of Sullivans. I already mentioned Little Tim Sullivan. He was one cousin. There were 2 other cousins. There was Christy, and there was also Florence, known as Flory. These were also cousins. Also Larry Mulligan, one of his stepbrothers, is going to function as an advisor in the area. He also has people with interesting names like Photo Dave Altman, who was the official photographer of the organization, and Sarsaparilla Riley, who also did not drink. He always ordered sarsaparilla, which everybody thought was quite amusing in the Lower East Side. So he's got this family network, and they bond with each other, in this personal nexus, and he's sort of like the pater familias. One of the things he is going to do, and he is going to reach out very directly to the Jewish and the Italian residents in the Lower East Side. For one thing, if he's going to be successful down there, he can't do it simply with the Irish vote, or even simply with the Catholic vote, because that is changing. And he himself is remarkably open to this, and I think in many ways he was in the forefront of being open to these new immigrants, whom truthfully many of the older immigrant groups, and also including some of the Irish and Germans, looked upon with disdain, as the Yankees had looked down on them when they actually arrived. And before too long, you begin to see that some of his electoral district captains, these are the guys, who will be in sort of the subdivisions of the overall congressional district, they're going to be Jewish, they're going to be Italian. He's going to demonstrate that anybody can come to him for help. Notoriously or famously, when an Irish gang attacked a group of Jews who were attempting to set up a storefront synagogue, Sullivan sent in his men to drive them out, and he gave it to the Jewish congregation. And he would certainly adopt things that he needed to do along the way, which would please these people. So, for example, he pushed for making Columbus Day a state holiday in New York before it was a national holiday. In 1902, when he was no longer, he was serving in Congress, which he didn't pay a lot of attention to. He once said that, congressmen were like, hitching posts down there, they don't really do anything. And so he spent most of his time back in the city. But in 1902, he was celebrating a birthday, and he took throughout the entire Bowery, Lower East Side area, basically what, in medieval times would be called a royal procession. And he went to, the various Jewish businessmen's club. He also went to the various synagogues. He also went to the Italian delicatessens. And, of course, he went to the various Irish saloons. But he goes from one to the other. And in virtually all of these places, there's going to be prominently featured a picture of Big Tim Sullivan saying, "Our leader." All right, and he makes himself, as his friends like to call him, the king of the Bowery. What does he provide? Before, let's say, 1909, in some ways, he is an outsized but still fairly conventional Democratic politician. He is very good. Oh my God! With constituents served. I thought I did for like 5 minutes. Okay, I get wound up with this character. So, for example, he does provide fuel. He does provide food. He does provide clothing. He does provide legal services. The biggest event in the Lower East Side in the summertime, perhaps the biggest one in the year, was his Labor Day chowders. They used to rent excursion boats, and they would go to places, which had amusement parks at, College Point. From the time you got on the boat, a couple of things would happen. One, lots of beer. Number two, lots of food. Number three, when you got there, all the rides you wanted. And number four, gambling left, right, and center. Sullivan, to his enemies, is king of the underworld. He is an inveterate gambler. He's not a good gambler. He blows lots of money on gambling, but he loves it. Gambling was illegal. He protects gamblers. All right. He also had connections with various organized crime groups. One of his, groups of enforcers when he first starts out was an Irish gang called the Wyos. By the time you get to the 1900s, you're going to find that he is on first-name familiarity and exchanges of services with various Jewish and Italian gangs. Sometimes he will use these people as repeaters, meaning you send them to the polls, more than once. And of course, the old Tammany line, vote early and often, that kind of thing. He was also accused, most famously in 1901, with involvement in prostitution, which he always vehemently denied. And there's no clear evidence that he was directly involved, but it was all over the Tenderloin and the Lower East Side at the time, and certainly his captains were. After 1909, there's a shift with his thinking, and it may have something to do with events such as the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. It may have something to do with unionization among the Jewish women garment workers. Whatever the case may be, he is going to be an early advocate of what were generally seen as progressive reforms as pushed by some of the reform groups. He's going to come to this not out of ideology, but I think out of understanding the people and what they need, and that something has to be done on more than an ad hoc basis, which is what Tammany had been doing. For example, he will go back to the state senate. He will push through a law which will bring small privately owned banks, which primarily dealt with immigrants and first-generation people under state control so that people couldn't be shafted, all right? Maybe he should be around today to work on that. He was a major advocate of women's suffrage, and he pushed it publicly. He had many connections with essentially college-educated, elite reform women, and he would sometimes show up at their meetings, and he was cheered, and to see all of these, primarily New Englanders and Upper East Side types cheering Tim Sullivan because he was a supporter of women's issues was, as I put it in my book, an exotic experience on both sides because they'd never seen anything like him, and he certainly didn't have a hell of a lot of experience with any of them. He was not successful in getting that through. Charlie Murphy and much of Tammany Hall was more cautious in this than he was. He was, of course, the author of the Sullivan Law, which attempted to control the carrying of concealed weapons. Perhaps his finest hour is in the 1912 legislative session, where he is crucial in getting a law put through which limited women's weekly hours to 54 hours, which gives you an indication of what was possible at the time. And it's Sullivan which nails it home, partly because Murphy's opposed to it, and it's fun to tweak Murphy's nose and prove who is, really the key player. Unfortunately, Sullivan will go into a steep decline at this particular point in time, and it's primarily mental psychological. There were rumors that he was suffering from third-stage syphilis. I understand there may be a document out there. I was never able to find it. Certainly looking at the newspaper reports, the public accounting, that is not mentioned. Looks like he was suffering from manic depression and possibly paranoia, so he certainly began to unravel. At the same time, one of his connections with a Jewish gambler by the name of Rosenthal brought him a lot of unwanted publicity. Rosenberg, Rosenthal is somebody else, Rosenthal is right. Hermann Rosenthal, he was killed in a gangland shooting. Rumors swirled about, Sullivan's involvement with this. Tammany and the machine within the machine try to sweep that under the rug. Big Tim has an unhappy end. He is mentally broken. He's staying at his brother's place in Eastchester in the Bronx. He's playing poker with his nurses. They fall asleep. He does not. He leaves. He disappears. He's gone for a week. No one knows where Big Tim is. On September 12th, 1913, a police officer fulfilling the standard requirement that before you send a body to Potter's Field, you look one more time and see if you can identify somebody who has not been identified, realizes it's Big Tim Sullivan. His body was found on the railroad tracks. It was cut in half by a train. He was probably dead before he actually hit the tracks, however. His funeral was a major event in the Bowery. 20,000 people go buy his beer. He is not going to be buried in Greenwood with all those Yankees and reformers, even if Tweed was there to desegregate it. He is, in fact, buried in the Tammany Valhalla Calvary Cemetery, along with Al Smith, along with Robert Wagner, Sr. and Jr., and along with Charles Francis Murphy. Thank you.
Didn't he make a deal with Monk Eastman, who was one of the first of the organized Jewish gangsters?
Vaccarelli and Eastman.
I have a primitive cell phone here, but lest you think that I'm being impolite, it is also a stopwatch. And it just started. First of all, I want to thank City University and Suzanne for bringing together the four of us for this very thoughtful discussion. I also think it's quite wonderful that City University reached out to Peter Quinn for this, because when we're having a thoughtful discussion, it's really important to include people who are not thoughtful, just to mix it up a little bit. As a graduate student, as the world's oldest graduate student, I'm learning a lot of things that I never thought I would learn. And so one of the good things I have gotten from graduate school is that the process of historical revision is always ongoing. Of course, in the Irish context, when you talk about revisionists, you generally are talking about sort of Tory historians who are trying to explain why things really weren't so bad in Ireland while people were dying and being oppressed and such. But here in the United States, revisionists have taught us many things since the 60s, and we now think of areas like the Progressive Era, Reconstruction, enslavement, the role of women. We think of those eras or those topics in very different ways now because of the wonderful work of new historians who seek to reach the voices of those whom history has left mute. And most of the graduate students I deal with, all of whom are 25 years younger than I am, but they are very earnest in their desire to get beyond sort of the history of the great men, great white men generally, and reach out to Native American groups and African American women and all sorts of groups that have been rendered mute by history. What I would like to see, and maybe that's why I'm writing my dissertation on this topic, is that I haven't yet seen that revisionist impulse directed towards urban politics in general and Tammany Hall in particular. And there have been some bold efforts. I mean, there's 3 bold efforts today. And as Peter mentioned, there have been bold efforts in the past by historians whose names are probably unfamiliar to most of you. They're only on graduate school reading lists, regrettably. But basically, the narrative of Tammany Hall hasn't changed a whole lot since Lincoln Steffens wrote The Shame of the Cities, right? And I know my own that wasn't my cell phone.
No,
Just wanted for the record.
Sorry.
So, my 15 minutes are God, jeez. Lincoln Steffens was, of course, one of the great muckrakers and did wonderful work exposing the shame of the cities. But it's his narrative, the narrative that Pete Hamill just sort of mentioned too, where politicians were evil. And if you read The Shame of the Cities, as I had to twice, you realize that it wasn't just Tammany Hall that Lincoln Steffens and the reformers hated. It was really politics itself. Mass politics. And remember, in the era that most of us are talking about, the Progressive Era, what the progressives in the South are doing is installing Jim Crow, taking the franchise away from African Americans. Well, they were trying to do the same thing here in the North as well. There was serious discussion in New York about putting a property qualification on the right to vote. It obviously didn't go anywhere, but that speaks to that sort of chip on the shoulder defensiveness that Tammany Hall had. It was very Irish, it was very Catholic, and it was very necessary. Now, the other thing that I would like to see modern historians or historians today use these tools of cultural history, I'd like to see them apply to the immigrants, who, after all, were the ultimate arbiters of Tammany Hall. I mean, they could vote against you. And by the way, they did. During the golden era of Tammany Hall, which I'll be talking about in a minute, the era of Big Tim Sullivan, and the era of Charles Francis Murphy especially, and the era of Bob Wagner, and the era of Al Smith, Tammany lost some pretty big elections. They lost the governor's race in 1916 to Charles Evans Hughes, and they lost the mayor's election in 1913. They lost the mayor's election to John Perroy Mitchell. So for a brief period of time, Charlie Murphy was in hot water. Now, Murphy was, I think, the greatest boss of Tammany Hall. And it was of Murphy that Lincoln Steffens complained in the Shame of the Cities, where he says, if you want to understand urban politics, you have to understand that there is a boss, and that boss controls 50,000 votes. And that's why they succeed. Well, Murphy's predecessor as the head of Tammany Hall probably had a better reason, and actually Richard has already mentioned Richard Croker's quote, which I have exactly because I'm an academic. Oh, so are you. Richard Croker's philosophy, and these cardboard, cartoonish characters that you've read about in history, I believe, had a there, and there was a soul to some of these people. And this is what Richard Croaker had to say. If we go down in the gutter, it is because there are men in the gutter, and you have to go down where they are if you're going to do anything for them. Now, Richard Croaker was indeed a crook. He left New York to race thoroughbreds in Ireland and won the Derby. I don't think he got that from his salary, but there was an ideology there. There was a philosophy of social democracy, crude and primitive though it may have been. There was something to it, which gets to another interpretation of Tammany Hall that I never see, and therefore will have to write someday, which is we sort of get the sense, right, that Tammany was conspicuously Irish and conspicuously Catholic, and often it's left at that. Well, but what did that mean? And I think all of our speakers have are trying to get at precisely what that meant. When you say that Charles Francis Murphy was a devout Catholic, as everybody does, well, what does it mean? He had 20 children? Or does it mean that maybe he understood at some level some of the social teachings that were very popular in the Catholic Church after 1893 with Pope Leo XIII? Now, I don't have any proof that Charlie Murphy ever read anything, but I do know how he acted once he was in power. Murphy like Sullivan, Murphy graduated grammar school, and that was it. He owned saloons, like Sullivan. And when he got into Tammany Hall, he would post himself at the corner of 20th and 2nd Avenue in the Gas House District, which is where he grew up, poor. And everybody knew that if you wanted to go see your local district leader, Charlie Murphy was there every night at that lamppost. And later on, when he succeeded Croaker as the head of Tammany in 1902, once a week, it was open house. Every district leader came in to report to Charlie Murphy about what conditions were on their districts, what were the needs, what were some of the constituents, or they didn't call them constituents back then, I'm sure, but who needed what? And the district leaders were always amazed that Murphy never took notes because he was a good listener. He was called Silent Charlie Murphy. In fact, there was one point at a ceremony, Murphy was standing much straighter than I am now as they were playing the the Star Spangled Banner. It wasn't the national anthem just yet. And the reporters noticed that Murphy wasn't singing along. And the reporter said to one of Murphy's friends, "Hey, what's with the boss? Why isn't he singing?" And they said, "Well, maybe he doesn't want to commit himself." But Charlie Murphy did commit himself. He committed himself to Al Smith and to Bob Wagner, two of the most extraordinary politicians New York State has ever produced. And they were creatures of Tammany Hall. They were unapologetic members of Tammany Hall, and they were protégés of Charlie Murphy. After 1911, after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and through his death in 1922, Murphy was the progressive in New York, small p progressive. In 1913, just to give you an idea, in 1913, while most of the press was covering Murphy's pissing match with the governor, Governor Sulzer, who actually he impeached with good reason. But while that was going on, here's what the New York legislature, which was under Murphy's control, this is what they passed. They passed bills regulating work hours for women, improving sanitary conditions in the workplace, requiring fire alarms in commercial buildings despite the opposition of landlords. He developed benefits for widows and children, ratified the federal income tax, gave new powers to the state's Public Utility Commission, slapped down new regulations on the New York Stock Exchange, and despite his opposition, scheduled a public referendum on women's suffrage. That was one legislative session. Francis Perkins, who would go on to become Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor in 1933, Francis Perkins says that the legislation passed in 1913 alone, that contribution to the change in American political attitudes cannot be overrated. And Murphy was just beginning. Because in 1918, he took his star, Al Smith, and ran him for governor. And yes, he did have that power. If Murphy thought that Al Smith was going to run for governor, then Al Smith ran for governor, and he won. And when Smith was brought to the governor's office, Murphy sat down with him and said, Al, there are going to be times when I'm going to ask you for things, and you're not going to want to give them to me. And that's okay. And it was okay. And Smith and Murphy formed this wonderful relationship, which led to things like passage of workers' compensation, bond issues to build hospitals and schools, and a whole raft of social legislation in the 1920s that Franklin Roosevelt said in the 1930s. He basically said nothing we did in the New Deal was new because it was done by Al Smith in the 1920s. Al Smith of Tammany Hall, Al Smith of the Lower East Side, Al Smith, the 8th grade graduate. And this was the kind of operation, I think, that this was the soul of Tammany Hall. And it is the story, I think, that some of us may be familiar with, but far too many people are not. When I proposed my dissertation at Rutgers and I told some of these stories, I looked in the faces of some of my fellow graduate students, and it was as if I were speaking Greek. They had no idea. And one of them said to me, well, Boss Tweed, he was Irish, right? I said, no. Scots Presbyterian, thank you very much. Murphy died in 1924 on the verge of he did not live to see Al Smith nominated for president in 1928. And Tammany went downhill after Murphy died. But Murphy had a successor. It was Ed Flynn, who was the boss of the Bronx, which was not Tammany Hall. And Flynn went on to be one of Franklin Roosevelt's most important political advisors. And maybe after Louis Howe died in 1936, you could probably say that Ed Flynn was the most important political advisor in the Roosevelt administration. In 1943, here's what Ed Flynn wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt. 1943, in the middle of the war, World War II. It seems to me that we can never have a complete settlement of world conditions until the Anglo-Saxon begins to realize he is not of a superior race, but that all races are equal. Certainly we are today fighting against the ideology of Hitler, in which he sets forth the Aryans as superior people to all others. We do not seem to be consistent when we fight against this doctrine on the one hand and do nothing at home to bring about a better understanding between the races. The brains and the soul of Tammany Hall. Thanks a lot.